Hello everyone and welcome to Site and Life's second webinar in our series of 4 focusing on behaviour change communication. A special welcome back to those who've attended our previous webinar and to those joining us for the first time. We are really delighted you could log in today, and if you'd like to hear what we discussed in webinar 1, a link to the slides and the recording is available in resources on Site and Life website, siteandlife.org. As we mentioned in our webinar on the 24th of April, this series really examines the BCC process from the program manager's point of view. We emphasize experiential knowledge combined with research analysis and identify tools and tips to help the program manager manage the BCC process. You may recall in our first webinar, how to incorporate behavior change communication into nutrition programs, we looked at BCC as a communication approach with distinct underlying principles, and outlined the importance of taking a systematic approach to the use of Site and Life's 8-step process. We then looked in detail at step 1 in this process, setting your goals and objectives. Today's webinar will continue to take you through the BCC 8-step process as you begin to gather information on drivers, threats, and barriers related to your target behaviors. The subsequent webinars will provide insight on the BCC strategy and rollout, and lastly examine if the process is working. Just a little introduction to Site and Life. We're a humanitarian think tank guided by the vision of a world free from malnutrition. We focus on linking research to implementation to support positive nutrition outcomes. Our work involves guiding original nutrition research, disseminating the findings, and facilitating dialogue to bring about positive change in this regard. My name is Breda Gavin-Smith and I'm a public health nutritionist and the Nutrition Program Manager at Site and Life, and I'm really delighted to again be moderating today's webinar. Over the next 45 minutes, my colleague Dr. Eva Monterosa will present webinar 2 entitled Assessing the Situation, What You Need to Know. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you're not orientated with Zoom, you will find a toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window. You may have to hover your cursor along the lower part of the window for it to appear. Here in the lower left corner, you can manage your settings. The chat box can be found in the middle. And if you have any technical difficulties or general questions during the presentation, please type them into the Zoom chat box and we will do our best to find a solution. You will also find the Zoom Q&A on the lower toolbar. At any time, please submit your questions for the Q&A session following the presentation through the Zoom Q&A, and I look forward to posing as many as possible. We're also active on social media and encourage you to engage with us through our Twitter hashtag #SalWebinar, which will appear in the chat box. Finally, a PDF of the slides and a recording of the webinar will be available on the Site and Life website. Now, without further ado, it's a real pleasure today to introduce our presenter, Dr. Eva Monterosa. Eva is a Senior Scientific Manager at Site and Life, and in this role leads the Implementation Science area, managing a broad portfolio that includes food supplements and market delivery models, behavior change communication models for complementary feeding, women's nutrition, and nutrition and wash. Eva also offers strategic advice to partners in academia and UN agencies on design and implementation of nutrition programs, and assists WFP in behavior change communication. I will hand you over to Eva for the presentation.
Thank you, Breda. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning from wherever you might be joining us. A very warm welcome to those who joined webinar 1. We're very glad to have you again here for webinar 2, where we will examine the program manager's knowledge needs for designing a BCC intervention. A special thanks again to our communication and design team, Nola Martin, Annie Milan, and many thanks to Jana Maniuk for her valuable inputs into today's webinar. Today we will be discussing 4 topics. We begin with a quick review of step 1, and there's a very brief discussion about framing your knowledge needs. And then we examine in more detail steps 2 and 3 of our BCC process cycle. So let's get started because we have a lot to cover today. Let's begin with a quick review of step 1. Step 1 was focused on our goal and behavior objective setting. And we ended our last webinar with a checklist, the one you see here. At this point in the process, we have established a small multi-stakeholder committee of about 5 people who we affectionately call our brain trust. and they will help steer the BCC process. We have set our BCC goal, and we've clearly indicated our behavior objectives, both of which are aligned with our program goals. And we have an initial list of the potential constraints and barriers on the behavior. We're particularly vigilant about the barriers because these factors impede the BCC process. In the assessment phase, which we're about to begin, we're working to minimize or eliminate those barriers. So in webinar 1, we introduced Site and Life's 8-step process cycle, and today we'll cover steps 2 and 3, and together these 2 steps form the bulk of the assessment phase. In our last webinar, a member of our audience wondered why our BCC process starts with setting objectives when most projects begin with desk research. And the answer to this excellent question lies in framing our knowledge needs. So it's not wrong, of course, to start with a desk review. However, program managers have competing demands on their time, so we have found it quite easy, in fact, to begin a desk review after step 1, where we define the knowledge needs and boundaries. So firstly, the knowledge boundaries are set by the program itself, because you're resolving for very specific behaviors. And secondly, the behavior objectives we set in step 1 guide what is relevant and what is useful to you and what information is outside of scope. So this is how we can set our knowledge boundaries and define our knowledge needs. Let's look at a specific example. So in our last webinar, we introduced our anemia control program example. And if you consider the intervention, which is the provision of a voucher to purchase eggs and vegetables, take a moment to read the columns on the BCC goal and behavior objectives. With a simple rephrasing of the behavior objectives, I can define my knowledge needs around purchasing patterns and meal preparation of vegetables and eggs for families. I now have a topic guide for my desk review. All right, so now let's dig into that desk review. For each step, again, just to recap, we present the critical elements that you need to complete for each of the steps. So here are the 3 critical elements for the desk review. The name, in fact, the desk review is a little misleading, I would say, because there are more engaging ways to gather the information than, in fact, just reading documents or doing Google searches. And step 2 is led by the program manager, and it takes about 4 business days to collect all the information and write up this brief. Okay, so let's look at these 3 elements. The first element is to understand how the broader context will affect your BCC strategy. And we introduced the PESTEL tool and the stakeholder analysis tools to help you with this task. The second element is to draw on previous experiences. And usual sources of information are found in the published literature, in program reports, and the experiential knowledge of program managers who have walked down this road before. And the third element is the program context, because you must know how well the program itself functions as a delivery platform if you'll be using the program to deliver your BCC intervention. Okay, so here are a few helpful tips that I want to share with you before we dive in with the desk review. Number 1, stay focused during the desk review. This is not an assessment of the food system, so let the behavior objectives we set in step 1 guide you through this process. Secondly, use this opportunity to identify more barriers for your BCC process. This will be useful for taking a go or no-go decision later on. And thirdly, the desk review should absolutely help you assist or assist you with planning your BCC intervention. Okay, let's look at the PESTEL tool. So the advantage of this tool is to, in fact, help you to systematically identify the various factors that may affect the BCC intervention. Okay, so Don't be overwhelmed when you look at this table. Working through this table does not mean that you need to sit and read reports for days on end. The sources of information will vary. Some of this you already know, such as your health indicators. You're probably very familiar with those in your regions. And other information likely resides in people's brains. So it's good to rely on your network to get this information. Take people for coffee or tea, invite them for lunch. And then some of this is already available in the executive summaries of various reports and legal documents. Right, let's look at the P for political. It's important to know when local elections will be held. Why? Because political campaigns create a lot of noise. And if you roll out your BCC campaign during that time, your BCC campaign will be completely drowned out. Let's look at the S for social. In some places where ethnic and clan lines are strong, you want to know if interpersonal communication will be accepted if it's delivered by outsiders. So this is important to know, and it helps you with your planning. And L for legal, another example is that some countries have very strict rules about communication channels for health topics. And this is a case right now for infant and young child feeding. So knowing in advance who can say what about what health topic is really critical for helping you target your communication message by your communication channel. That's the PESTEL tool. The next tool is the stakeholder analysis. And it's good, again, because it helps you systematically understand the persons or organizations that exist at various levels, from community levels to national levels, that are likely to have a vested interest in your program or your BCC intervention. So you will want to identify who holds power and influence, and you want to plot these individuals on a power influence matrix. You can do a Google search for that, and you'll see plenty of examples on how to do that. The next thing that the stakeholder analysis tool helps you do is to identify who supports or opposes the BCC intervention or nutrition program and why they do that. And the last element or information that you'll get is you want to identify the issues that are affecting the nutrition program in BCC from the point of view of those stakeholders. It's good to know how they would perceive your program or intervention. So why is this information useful? Why gather it systematically and in advance? Because you want to be prepared with a communication and engagement plan for important stakeholders. Some of them most likely sit on your brain trust, that small committee you've already developed, and that's great if they do. But if they don't, they require continuous updates from you, the program manager. All right, element 2 of the desk review is what people often associate with a traditional desk review. And here we want to understand two things: the drivers and constraints for the target behavior and previous communication efforts. Let's look at these in more detail. So when we've set our objectives in step 1, this will help you narrow down the information needs on the drivers and constraints for the target behavior. For example, in the anemia control program, we've defined our knowledge boundaries to be purchasing and meal preparation of vegetables and eggs among families. So the type of information I will now need would be related to prevalence data. Specifically, I'm looking for nutrition indicators such as dietary diversity and food insecurity. I also want to know the factors that determine purchasing and consumption of vegetables and eggs in families. So I'm looking for any food choice models, similar to the one I presented in webinar 1, or any other model from the literature. You might want to see, or hopefully your country has, or you yourself have conducted in the past, a knowledge, attitudes, and practice survey. And those are actually very useful at this stage. Or you want to look at the published literature and reports. And it's okay to draw from global experience at this stage if the findings are relevant to your target audience. For example, there might be research in Australia on interventions to address vegetable consumption, and they might give you good ideas for your context. And the last source of knowledge that you want to get is theoretical knowledge. So you're looking for behavior theories, psychological theories, sociological or cultural theories. whatever you have access to. And here again, you can use the help from your brain trust. So remember, you have a member of your brain trust is a knowledge partner. So you can ask them to help you find theories that are relevant for eating choices. I've listed in the second column sort of the most common theories that you'll find in nutrition. I'm not advocating for any one of these in particular, so it's just a list. But there's this really cool tool, and thanks to Yana, who brought it to my attention. It's called the Theory Picker. And I've placed the URL there. So it'll help you select which theory is most relevant for the situation that you face. And for the more advanced practitioners, you can search PubMed or Google Scholar and explore communication theories, such as those listed in the resource there at the University of Twente. Okay, and it's very, very important to learn from previous experiences, even if you yourself are an experienced program manager. So this table is for your reference, but I want to mention a few items that I've placed in bold. You want to ask partners and other managers on their cost estimates for their BCC strategy, because this will help you in allocating your costs. And other important knowledge needs are the common implementation bottlenecks that you'll find across many programs. For example, you'll want to think about critical paths, such as the government approvals for communication material, procurement processes for third-party services or for products. If you have to import a product, moving that product from the Port Authority, how long does that take, and what does that all entail? Your training of your staff and sort of in the learning periods or learning times that they need. And other things such as getting a service up to acceptable quality standards if you find that your service platform is of poor quality. And so you want to learn what the critical paths are so that you can also plan accordingly. And unless you have a degree in communication, which some of us do not, I don't, the program manager will rely on outside experts to help with the BCC. So it's good to know who these experts are, what are their service fees, and were they any good to work with? And how long did it take the partner to move through the contract process? So that's also tends to be a bottleneck sometimes as well. Okay, and the third element of your desk review is a program context analysis. And again, this is critical. It happens to be that case because you're embedding BCC into the program. So the program is a key channel for you, and you need to know how well the program is functioning. So you will want to understand elements around the service provision, in particular the frontline staff experience. How you can use focus groups and key informant discussions to examine how busy the staff are, what communication skills do they bring, what communication skills or tools do they desire, what are their views on the target behavior. For example, if frontline staff truly believe that ignorance is the primary driver of the behavior, they will focus on imparting knowledge, and perhaps in a manner that's patronizing. And they might be resistant to more motivational approaches. The other thing you want to understand from your program is how it is being used and perceived by the users. And in fact, if there is a differential usage by groups, so does a program by design or for some other reason exclude certain groups? Take the time also to sit and observe the service delivery. Look at wait times, how clients are treated. How does a service point look like? Is it clean? Is it orderly? Is it welcoming, etc.? These are things to pick up. And it's also important to get the perspective of village elders, so of the broader community, and how the program is perceived there. Talk to the community health workers or other frontline staff as well. And the third element of the program context analysis is the supply chain. And if your BCC strategy includes a product, you need to ensure that it is reliably available at the point of service, because stockouts are major threats to your BCC intervention. So you'll want to map out the supply chain for your product. In our case, it would be the supply chain for the vouchers themselves. So how do the vouchers get to program participants, but also the supply chain for eggs and vegetables. to make sure they're readily available in the communities where you'll be working in. Okay, again, just sharing a little bit of our knowledge or experience from the various projects that we've worked on. Please don't skip the desk review. The information and the engagement that the desk review fosters is critical to the success of your program. And it's good practice to draw on the experience of experts and the network intelligence to meet your knowledge needs. And some tips for doing so are to use the PESTEL and Stakeholder analysis tools as participatory tools in meetings. And in fact, both tools can be completed in under 2 hours. Try a workshop format to collect information on previous communication efforts. I mean, we did that in our last project in India, and we called it Download Day, which was a 4-hour workshop. In fact, you can have participants come prepared with the information that you need to know. And it should only take you a few hours to develop a presentation outline or a discussion guide for your workshop. And slide 23 is a good outline to use. And another sort of good practice would be to include your brain trust in all your stakeholder activities. It's important that your brain trusts know what the needs are at this step in the process. Okay, now it's time for a little bit of a poll. So Nola, I'm going to ask you to bring that up. Great. Oh, that's not the poll that we wanted. It's now, have you ever used any of these tools before? That's the one. So have you ever used the PESTEL tool, the stakeholder analysis tool, or a program context analysis tool? And it could be any one of those. Give you a moment to fill in the poll. Should we look at the results, Nola? Oh, good. I'm glad to see that a lot of you are using the stakeholder analysis. That's excellent. And a lot of you are also working on problem context analysis. Fantastic. The PESTEL tool is very easy to use. Trust me, try it once and you'll see you get a lot of valuable and useful information, and it's an excellent participatory tool as well. Okay, next slide. All right, so the main deliverable from the desk review should be a review brief, and literally it's very short. It shouldn't be more than 7 pages. And the purpose of having this brief is for programmatic decision making and helping you plan the immediate next steps of the BCC process. So I've indicated how each of the different knowledge outputs can be used in subsequent steps down this process. So for example, in the working hypothesis model, I said that you'll use that information in step 3, 4, and 5. And I've indicated elsewhere where that's the case. So again, this brief should have the PESTEL tool, the stakeholder analysis, that working model or working hypothesis for the behaviors in practice. It should also include any information that you gained from previous efforts. It should look at information about the program, so make sure there's data there on the coverage, utilization, quality, and satisfaction of the services. And the overall capacity in country to design and execute communication campaigns. So you should have a pretty good idea of who those resources are, or what those resources are. Okay, so again, the desk review should be used to make certain decisions, and that's the reason why the program manager should lead the desk review. You shouldn't fan that out to third-party services. That's something you should do yourself. And the brief that you prepare needs to be shared with the brain trust and discussed at a meeting. So the first decision is a go or no-go decision. And so it's based again on the information you've collected through the review. You have to, essentially you need to consider if the barriers are insurmountable. And if those barriers are insurmountable or you're entering into unethical terrains, a no-go decision should be taken. So at which point you suspend moving forward with the BCC process and you shift your focus to other activities to address the barriers. Let me give you an example. Say we're planning a WASH BCC intervention, and we find out in the desk review that there's really no good or reliable water source in the district where we plan to do this BCC intervention. So we decide that we lend support to existing coalitions that are active in clean water, or we support fundraising and advocacy for water security. Because the program manager's role is to ensure that the environment enables the behaviors. And some people argue that why not do advocacy and coalition building while you do BCC? And my simple answer to that is that availability and accessibility are critical paths to behavior change. And unless your program ensures access, BCC shouldn't advance past step 2. So in our example, the way we ensured access was through the voucher in our anemia control program. If you decide to go, so do you move forward with the BCC process, the program manager and the brain trust need to also decide whether step 3 is necessary. And step 3 is our client research. And at this point as well, you will need to agree on the scope and purpose for the client research. In my experience, client research will be needed because we usually don't have the audience insight for creating a BCC strategy. But it can happen, and it has happened, that there are good insights on the audience. So some good insights already exist. And ideally, the desk review would have led you to those sources. So you have access to that information, or you can use that information. You know, sometimes there's a good formative research study that has been done, or you've learned that a market research firm has very extensive information on egg and vegetable consumer habits, for example. These are rare occurrences, but they do happen. Also during this meeting, you want to set a budget for client research. Just be mindful that a small budget will not buy you much in the way of insight research. But you also don't want to spend half of your BCC budget on client research because you still have the creative design and implementation costs to cover. So you have to find a balance between what you need to know and how much you can spend. Okay, now let's move to step 3, which is client research. All right, having just completed your desk research, you have information about behaviors. And in step 3, what we need is information or insight about our audience. So that's why we do the client research. And an important disclaimer here is that client research is a domain expertise. Okay, so the purpose of the next set of slides is to help you evaluate the usability of client research for your BCC needs. I'm not going to show you how to do client research. That's a little too complicated for this webinar. All right, so actually let me go back. On this slide, the first bullet point that says, from the desk review, we have a working hypothesis and model. This really is the main link between your desk review and the client research. And so here is a working hypothesis model from a recent research we did in India, specifically in Rajasthan, looking at eating choices in pregnancy and lactation. So basically drawing on all the activities we did in step 2, we identified the critical drivers, the critical barriers, and key influencers of eating choices for women in Rajasthan, where we were working in. So those are listed here in the boxes. I'm not going to go into any detail on this, but the point is that once you have this type of working hypothesis model, what we need to do now is to drill down, and we need to see the relevance and importance of these factors and to find the windows of opportunity that are likely to yield the greatest change, and in our case, behavior change. So for example, we knew there were taboos up there on the box that says beliefs. We knew that were the taboos in pregnancy and lactation, but we didn't know for whom they were important. Did women really believe these food taboos, or were they a way of accepting advice that came from their elders? What about the husbands indulging their pregnant wives? how did this indulgence play out in the household food environment? So these are all things that we had gathered during the desk review, and now we wanted to dig down deeper in step 3. Some program managers will see this model and will be tempted to address all of these factors in the intervention. And my advice to you is, please don't. You will spread yourself out too thin, and not all the factors that you think matter to your audience. All right, so again, let's look at the 3 critical elements for completing step 3. So in this step, we need to apply the old adage, begin with the end in mind. So your research must lead to actionable insight, one that we can use to develop a communication campaign or a communication strategy. And a strategy is like an overall game plan, a grand design, and overall approach, right? So that's the end. That's the end game at this step. So the 3 elements of step 3 are presented here. And this is our Sight and Life formula for actionable insights. Is first to select your inquiry framework, then you select your methods, and these 2 together will yield insights that you can use to develop your BCC campaign. To be sure, insights are not just generated in the data analysis phase, because a lot of insights emerge as soon as you start data collection. And client research of the type we'll be discussing today is normally undertaken with a relatively small sample size, usually in the ranges of 30 to 80 individual participants. All right, let's explore each of these in more detail. So in nutrition, we use inquiry frameworks to define the scope and purpose for our research. Each framework has its own strengths and limitations, and regardless of the ones you choose, you will need the advice of an external expert, because they will help you with the choice of questions, the methods, and the analysis of the qualitative data, and they'll assist you with the theoretical literature. So the FES and the RAP are very comprehensive approaches, and they rely on ethnographic methods. The FES, for example, it draws on the biocultural framework as its inquiry framework. The advantage of FES and RAP is that they're all inclusive. They come with an inquiry framework and the methods. They're ready to go. GAIN has developed an FES manual for infant and young child feeding, for example. And you can adapt these manuals, but you need the input of the creators of the tools to do so. And because they're predefined tools, the scope is usually set for broad program planning or intervention planning. But when it comes to BCC within nutrition programs, when we're solving for very specific issues and behaviors, the FES and the RAP actually gives you more information than you might need. So just keep that, so be aware of that. Another common inquiry framework are the acceptability trials. They're also called the trials of improved practices or behavioral trials. And these are popular for trialing innovations. And you can find a manual for improved practices online. So it's widely available. Acceptability trials in general focus on the usability of a product, a service, or a behavior. So they're looking at how is it used, what are some of the problems that arise during its use, and is it a feasible or appropriate approach. Acceptability trials are very helpful if you're using rapid prototyping or iterative trials, and if you're adapting or adopting an intervention from some other country or geography. The disadvantage of acceptability trials is that they tend to miss the broader social environment because they're so focused on the innovation. At Sight and Life, we use the build your own inquiry framework with our clients because I have found them to be better suited for BCC. So remember, the objective is to gain insights so that I can develop a communication strategy. And I have specific knowledge needs that my client research must uncover. And so I need a framework that is flexible yet focused. The trade-off with these build your own frameworks is that you get less comprehensive data for deep insights. And we normally build this inquiry framework from our working hypothesis, which I just put it up there. You know, and the build your own framework allows you to use other approaches too. So I've seen acceptability trials being combined with build your own. I've also seen the RAP combined with acceptability trials. So at Sight and Life, we've drawn on a number of inquiry frameworks, and in Ghana, for example, for the Obasima campaign, we use the FES for women. And because we have in-house qualitative research expertise, we've designed our own inquiry frameworks for our partners in India. Okay, Nola, time for a second poll. So we would like to know from the audience, which inquiry frameworks are you most familiar with? Is it the FES? That should be rapid assessment procedures, not rapid ethnographic procedures. The acceptability trials, build your own, or others. Can we see the results, Nola? Ah, very good. Good. Good to see that you're using those ones. The FES is very good. Acceptability trials are also great. Okay. Good. So the second principle of BCC is that it's audience focused. So I had used this slide on our last webinar, and I said it was a good checklist for your client research. And in fact, you can build the inquiry framework from these set of question categories, so to speak. So the first one is know your audience. Who are they? What is their demographic profile? What's important to them? What motivates them in life? What are their sources of satisfaction or happiness? What are their concerns? What are their worries? What activities do they do to make them feel good? Do they have any hobbies? What are their social recreations? Who and what inspires them and why? Ask about TV, film stars, or even someone from their community. It might be a neighbor, a teacher, or a local leader. You want to know what the causes and what causes and influences their behavior. So that's the second point. How do they feel when they do the behavior in question? What does the audience perceive to be the rewards, the benefits, the costs, and the constraints, and the barriers associated to those behaviors? What other behaviors compete for their time and attention? And where is this competition coming from? For example, if you're looking at snacking behaviors, the junk food industry competes with fruits and other healthy snacks. So you want to understand more about junk foods too. So that's a competitor. The third point is how does your audience problem solve? So what human and material resources are available to them, and what are their go-arounds for the constraints and the costs and the competitions they face? And the last inquiry category is how much do they know about the consequences of the behavior? How do they access the information? What are their credible sources of information? And why are they credible? And how do they use your program to access information? So a lot of it has to do with their knowledge needs, for instance. Okay, so this slide essentially summarizes the categories that I showed in the previous slide. So rows A and B shows that summary. And essentially, rows A and B are the knowledge needs that are met by your client research. Okay. Again, I'm not going to go through this. This is for your reference. And on rows C and D, I have examples of the common methods, and I've put the names in bold, that you will use, or that you can use, or that are common to use for extracting information. And I've also highlighted why you would draw on these methods. So for interviews, you want to use interviews because they get at how people do things, processes, you can ask why, you can explore attitudes, yeah, so on and so forth for each of those. So in our Eat More, Eat Better project, the one we did in India, we used 22 interviews with pregnant and lactating women. We did 7 home observations, full day observations with a subsample of those women. We did 16 focus group discussions with each of our key influencers. So the husbands, the mother-in-laws, and the frontline health workers. And we relied on stimulus research to generate deeper insights. And this was especially useful given that women didn't say a lot in open-ended question format. A couple of important points to make on the slide. As you can see, there is no one right method. And in fact, good client research uses a combination of methods and tools for knowledge extraction. And client research is an expert domain because it takes an expert to know how all of these knowledge categories on rows A and B there fit together, what methods to use to extract deeper insights. So keep this in mind when you're working with kind of tougher nutrition problems. You really want to go with the experts who've been doing this type of work for a while. Okay, so let's move on now to insight generation. All right, so we had our little formula, right? We were building out, we create an inquiry framework, or we select an inquiry framework, and then we choose our methods, and then the last element is insight generation. So insight generation, actually this slide comes to us from Dr. Merritt, who explained what the difference between these concepts. But I want to give a shout out to our graphic designer, Annie, because she created this graphic, and I think it's stupendous because it actually shows you the difference between these three categories. Insight is moving from taking data to the deep truth, the so what, right? So you make sense of the data points, you draw on those connections, and then you distill down to those elements that are most critical. And insight generation is both a science and an art. And you need expert help to get at insights. And these experts often sit in creative agencies. And when we conducted our client research in India, we asked the advertising agency to be part of our client research to help us get at those deep insights. So with insight, we want to answer, so what? What are the deep truths? What are the emotional hooks, the shared truth, the people's desires and aspirations, their positive feelings? Those are the things we seek. And we seek those elements because they have a resonance and relevance to the target audience. And these will inform the foundation for your BCC strategy. Our task as program managers is to ensure that whatever it is we're creating, so that new behavior or that unfamiliar behavior feels familiar and comfortable to our audience. So you have to make sure that whatever research is being created is drawing on insights. Okay, insights is kind of, it's a little hard to explain unless you've done it or been part of it. So let me give you a few examples from our work, and hopefully this will, yeah, it'll be clear afterwards. So just try, as you hear me talk, just pay attention to the shared truths or the positive beliefs or emotional hooks that I will try to highlight in each of these examples. So in Ghana, for Obasima, what you see there on the slide, we use the focus ethnographic research. And that research revealed that pregnant and lactating women knew they needed to eat specific foods, but they felt that in doing so, they were putting their needs ahead of their family's needs. And this, of course, was not seen good or favorably. So it was unbecoming of a good mother or a good wife to put herself over her family. The creative agency took this research insight to develop the slogan, "Love yourself, stay strong for your family." And they used the name Obasima for our campaign and our logo, which in Akan language means the woman of substance, or a complete woman. A woman which is more than a mother, a daughter, or a wife. Let me give you another example from our Eat More, Eat Better project in India. So the kitchen, so here are two insights. The kitchen was, what we found was that the kitchen was a domain of the mother-in-law, and this posed certain constraints for food access for the daughter-in-law. And the new wives were especially vulnerable because they had yet to navigate the permission and approval systems of the household. Another insight was the existence of special containers to store foods, which and the foods that were stored in these containers were foods purchased by the husband for his wife. And the creative design team opted for a treat box or a treat bag for mothers working in the field. And this treat box or bag became the way that we diverted food access privileges from the mother-in-law to the husband and to the wife. And so the husband could continue his treat buying behavior, but now for dried, nutritious foods to be placed in this box. Another insight is related to knowledge. And a lot of BCC interventions are built around knowledge and messaging. And knowledge can be an insight, but it's knowledge driven by the audience needs rather than expert needs. So again, in India, we found that pregnant and lactating women, they told us that the type of nutrition messages that they were hearing were not useful to them. They said to me, we already know we need to eat more vegetables, we need to drink milk. That's what they always say to me. So when I was sitting with these focus groups, I told the women, I said to them, what if I told you that bones begin to form in the 2nd month of pregnancy and that calcium found in milk helps shape those bones? It was immediate. Their body language changed. They stood up. They were perked. They wanted to know more. They showed interest in that information. And some women at that focus group discussion spontaneously pledged not to complain about drinking milk. So it's important to frame, how we frame the message really matters for BCC. But that's just an example of insight generation for related to knowledge and messaging. All right, so we're nearing the end. I know it's a lot of information, but we're getting there. Okay, so step 3 culminates with the research report. And again, this should be maximum 20 pages. I've seen research reports in 200 or 300 pages, and that's just a lot of information to go through. So keep it brief and stay focused. So again, the information contained in the report are listed here. And it should, again, include the behavior objectives, which you would have refined based on the research that was completed. And now you will have specific behavior outcomes that you want to achieve. And this is important because we're going to track this in the monitoring and evaluation. You'll want to know about the emotional states and the hooks, those narratives, some of the things some of the examples I've just shown. This will form, this needs to be part of your research report. The other thing that you need is to identify the exchange values. So what are the rewards or the benefits and the costs and constraints associated with the behavior? You need to see that spelled out in the report very clearly. And the last thing you need is also knowing what other factors compete for the time and attention for your audience. So that should be part of the report. It's important that this report be shared and discussed with your brain trust, right? So you want to use this again as a tool to engage them and to understand what are the things we need to do now moving forward. And also at this stage, you should know about the different audience segments. And those ideally should also be identified either through the report or that's something that you do with the creative agency. And I want to briefly talk about segments before I end this presentation because it tends to be a sensitive subject, sometimes in fact not well understood in public health nutrition. But why do we need to segment? Because there's no such thing as targeting the general public, but we know this, right? So in public health nutrition, we've been doing audience segmentation, except we don't call it that. We've called it targeting. Right, so usually we've relied on the demographic targeting or geographic targeting or epidemiological targeting based on risk. But for BCC, you want to first identify segments on behavioral and psychographic elements, and then you can add the other ones such as demographic, epidemiological, etc. And you want to prioritize these segments according to clear criteria such as readiness to change. So let me give you an example again from the Eat More, Eat Better project. We decided to prioritize, so our key segment was going to be the first-time parents. And from a behavioral point of view, we knew that the woman was most vulnerable because she was new to the home and she didn't have the power to navigate the household food environment. She was also scared about her first pregnancy and she needed more guidance and support. And first-time parents were also younger couples with higher rates of literacy, and they had a readiness to covertly challenge the prevailing social norms that men should not be involved in household food affairs. And so we sought the communication tactics, so this is to the last point there, that spoke directly to these young couples or these first-time couples. For example, the mobile phone cards and the animated video and the treat box were targeting the husband, and we developed a pregnancy tracking book for the wives. And for the mother-in-law, a letter from the state authorities congratulating the family and supporting the husband's involvement in the wife's food choices. You can see that we had communication tactics for the different audience segments. And voila, we have finished step 2 and 3. I know it was a lot of information. So I will leave this checklist up as we take question and answers, so that might prompt a few ideas for the Q&A. Okay, Brita, back to you.
Great, thank you, Eva, so much for that really great presentation, and also for using those really great examples from Sight and Life to bring all the information to life. So that was super, and it's now over to our audience, who have been asking lots of questions, so much so that I can't quite keep up.
Oh,
but hopefully
gosh.
I've tried to identify as much as possible the questions relevant to today's webinar. Just to say that quite a lot of the questions were on BCC strategy, and also on the rollout and the advocacy needs around developing a BCC strategy. So a lot of those questions will be answered next week, or not next week, but in our next webinar, webinar 3, and Jana will take you through a lot of that. So a lot of those questions I've parked, and hopefully we can answer them for the next webinar.
Yeah.
So just to look at the first question, considering both the desk review, Eva, and the client research, what time should you allow for both of these steps, considering that there's often a limited budget and a time frame proposed, particularly by funders?
That's a good question. Excellent question. I think we need to educate our funders more as well, but point aside, I think the desk review, you can do that in 4 business days. It shouldn't take you long. As I said, some of this are participatory tools, and when you bring stakeholders together, you can get some of it done. The client research depends. Again, it depends on the scope and the breadth. So you can go from, somewhere between, I wouldn't go anything less than 3 weeks, because otherwise it's very quick. But I would say somewhere between a month and 2 months for the client research. And granted, the client research you won't do, so that's something you have to give out to a third-party service.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eva. So the next question is around the insight generation. The participant, or the participant of the audience, I should say, says, how do you describe the element? I like how you describe the element, I should say, around insight generation, but I'm challenged at a country level to find this expertise that can really dissect the information to create real insight on the target audience. As you say, it's an art. When you don't have that expertise, what are the other options you would advise?
Yeah, so if you can't pay, for example, to have already a creative agency on board when you do the client research, you may think outside the box by finding folks who are naturally creative, or who come from the creative professions, like a graphic designer, someone from journalism who can tell a story, create like a little, I would even create a little sort of a creative advisory board of 2 or 3 folks who come from the creative arts area, and have them review the insights, or have them participate in debriefing calls. They might have ideas for how to pick up on those small nuances that might be insights. Ideally, of course, you're working with more experienced professionals, and the more difficult the social problem is, you need to really think about bringing people who have more experience to do that work.
Great, thank you, Eva. We have 2 minutes left for our last question. Hopefully that's enough time, Eva, for you. It says, you didn't talk about quantitative research in step 3. Is there a reason for excluding this?
Yes, because quantitative research is really good for maybe step 2. So it provides understanding on the what's happening, like how many, or prevalence, right? How many people have X behavior or practice X behavior. Quantitative research doesn't really get at those deep insights. For that, you need to talk to people, not have them answer predefined questions.
Great, thanks, Eva. I think I have time to squeeze one more question in. Regarding the client research, you mentioned that you should not use all of the factors. So what factors do you think are the most important?
That's also the science and the art part. That's a good question. You're looking for these critical pathways or these critical windows that are likely to yield the most change. And that comes from understanding what's going on. Being embedded as part of the research. You're not going to get that from reading a report. So it's also being part of the research process, being debriefed by your research team, really thinking about, okay, what are the things that keep coming up? You also want to look for shared patterns. Again, that's what I'm saying. This is sort of a domain expertise. You're looking for shared patterns that you could use in a communication campaign that would be broadly received by many people.
Great. Thank you, Eva. I think, unfortunately, we have run out of time for more questions, but wow, we have a lot more questions that
I'm
that
so
have come
sorry that it was a lot of talking, and I do apologize, but we'll try to get to more questions maybe as part of the blog, and it looks like this is an area that a lot of people are interested in, so
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of topics that we can put into blogs based on the subjects that have been coming in. So I think we will definitely find a way around getting back to most people on these questions, potentially through a blog. But thank you so much, Eva, for the presentation. We hope you all found it informative and thought-provoking. And remember to check on our website. We will have all of the details on the webinars over the next few weeks. And our next webinar will take you through the BCC process as we go to the essence of designing and implementing the BCC strategy. As I already mentioned, Jana will share her tips and tricks for creative design and all the critical points on the rollout strategy, where we got a lot of questions on today. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll also receive a very brief survey on today's presentation, and we would really appreciate if you could take a moment to provide your feedback, because it's really important to us. And so on behalf of Sight and Life, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all again on webinar 3.
Great. Thank you, Brita. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.